Hi, everybody. Good morning. We're going to start promptly, so if everybody could take their seats, that would be great. Okay, so I hope you all had a restful night after a very long and intensive day yesterday. We're happy to see all of you back here with us today for what is going to be a very interesting day. Today is going to be the same as yesterday pretty much in terms of the structure and everything that we have planned. And today we're going to be discussing IHRA. We see great importance in preserving and strengthening the status of the IHRA, whose foremost mission is to preserve the memory of the Holocaust. The fight against anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Zionism, and the protection of historical truth are central parts of the IHRA organization, which only further emphasizes its importance. The institution brings together the best expert in the world currently working in the field. Their contributions are important tools for us, both in the field of preserving the memory of the Holocaust and, of course, in the fight against anti-Semitism. The main theme of this morning's plenum is IHRA, the organization, and its definitions. It is clear to all of us that this is an important issue, and the discussion will probably last far beyond the allotted time, but we still must ask everyone to accommodate the many speakers we have scheduled and to keep the time limit so that the day can be as smooth and prompt as possible. I am honored to invite for our first session our moderator, Dr. Robert Williams, who is the Deputy Director for International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Robert Williams, are you with us? Hi, good morning.
I thought you were going to say some more. I apologize.
No, that's what I have here.
Yeah,
Is
perfect.
there anything you want me to add, or?
No, Oh, okay.
Right. And along with our great moderator, we have a list of very esteemed speakers who are going to participate in the panel. Professor Dina Porat of the Cantor Center, Tel Aviv University. Professor Erwin Kotler, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and the Special Envoy for Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. Ambassador Michaela Kuchler, Special Representative for Relations with Jewish Organizations, Issues Relating to Anti-Semitism, International Sinti and Roma Affairs, and Holocaust Remembrance. Ambassador Kuchler will be joining us online virtually in this hybrid session. Dr. Mark Weitzman, Director of Government Affairs at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and a member of the U.S. delegation to IHRA U.S. Katharina von Schnurbein, European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism, who will also be joining us online. Lord John Mann, Advisor to the British Government on Anti-Semitism, a sitting member of the House of Lords, who will also be joining us online. Lord Eric Pickles, Special Envoy for Post-Holocaust Issues, who will also be joining us online. I wish you guys a fruitful and eventful day, and we look forward to hearing your feedback after the session.
Thank you very much. So that was a long list of names. I'll just remind you of mine. I'm Robert Williams. In addition to my work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, it's been my privilege for too many years, I'm getting old, to serve as a U.S. delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and also for a long time as chair of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. So, as mentioned, the topic of our discussion will be the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, also known as the IHRA, sometimes known as IHRA, sometimes known as IHRA, but we know what we're going to talk about. We're going to focus on some of the better known works of that particular organization, specifically two of its three non-legally binding working definitions: the non-legally binding working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, and that much better known working definition of anti-Semitism. But before doing so, I think it's important to reflect briefly on the IHRA as a whole. What is the IHRA? There is sometimes confusion around this point. Specifically, the IHRA is an intergovernmental body that unites governments and experts in order to strengthen, advance, and promote Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance, and Holocaust research on a global scale. Its foundations lie in something known as the 2000 Stockholm Declaration of the Holocaust, something affirmed more recently in a 2020 declaration in Brussels. Each delegation to the IHRA includes governmental representatives, usually from foreign or cultural ministries, and subject matter experts, some of whom are in the room today, of 34, soon to be 35 countries. Our goal really is to sweeten the field, if you will, to ensure permanent support for scholarly research innovative and cutting-edge education on the Holocaust, and the development and sustainability of an international culture that will always respect, value, and treat with the utmost seriousness our collective need to remember and reflect upon the Holocaust and its contemporary relevance today. Now, this work is not easy. The IHRA does not work on behalf of its member countries, it is its member countries. And in our, I'll be generous, politically desperate age, the challenges of ensuring the permanence we need has become more difficult now than ever. This situation is made more complex by rising anti-Semitism and a drive, unconscious or otherwise, to move away from remembering and honoring the destruction of civilizations and the mass murder of millions of Jews during the years between 1941 and 1945. That's why this discussion is so important today. And with that, I know I'm only the warm-up act. Let's get on to the main show. We're going to have 7 discussants, each with a unique perspective and deep commitment to the common goals of a world without anti-Semitism. Each of our discussants will have 5 to 7 minutes, closer to 5 if you can, in the interest of time. After their opening remarks, we will endeavor to have a small conversation between the discussants based on their statements, and then we will turn it over to you, our valued colleagues in the auditorium and online, I hope. Due to limitations on time and the number of people that will be speaking, I'm going to only provide the briefest of biographies for each. And our first speaker is my good colleague, Mark Weitzman. In addition to preceding me as chair of the IHRA Anti-Semitism Committee, Mark has initiated, or did initiate, and spearheaded the campaign to adopt both the IHRA working definition of distortion and denial and that for anti-Semitism. In his day job, Mark is Director of Government Affairs at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Vice President of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. And in addition to his several already published books, he and I will soon co-publish a massive history of anti-Semitism for Routledge. With that, Mark.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you as well for being such a stalwart colleague throughout the years. It's going to be a little hard just reading from here, but I'm going to just actually speak from it. But I wanted to thank you again for your work as chair of IHRA's Anti-Semitism Committee. Has been greatly responsible for the growth of IHRA's influence in this area. Since, as you already heard, I introduced this theory, the non-legally binding working definition through IHRA, I would like to give some perspective and context that I think would be useful thinking about it, and if you wish, also considering other definitions that have recently been raised. IHRA was born out of necessity. It was never conceived as an academic or scholarly definition put forward to spur discussion only, but rather as a practical working tool. Historians, and I'll only mention one, our late colleague and friend, Dr. Robert Bistrat, whose last public appearance was at the Global Forum in 2015, along with numerous theologians, both Jewish and non-Jewish philosophers, political scientists, psychologists, and social scientists have all offered their own definitions. So as you can see, scholars defining anti-Semitism and disagreeing with each other over those definitions is certainly not new. IHRA was born out of a particular set of circumstances. IHRA adopted its first working definition out of the working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion during the Toronto plenary of October 2013. It took about 5 years to get that definition adopted, as it had to be adopted by consensus. It was easy to get agreement with that hardcore Holocaust denial, especially in the wake of Deborah Lipstadt's historic court victory over David Irving, but we insisted on including a focus on Holocaust distortion. You can imagine how certain countries reacted to that. Thus, the 5-year diplomatic struggle until success was finally achieved under the Canadian chairmanship led by the parliamentarian Mario Silva. Immediately after that, Yehuda Bauer and I decided to follow up with an anti-Semitism definition. The purpose was to give the multinational and multidisciplinary delegates of IHRA a common, agreed-upon definition of anti-Semitism to assist in their work. But at the same time, there was a topical imperative as well. The summer of 2014 saw Operation Protective Edge in Gaza, which started the Gaza war that we have just lived through, triggered a wave of violent anti-Semitism internationally. The need for a practical definition became evident, thanks to incidents like the firebombing of a synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany in July 2014 by 3 Palestinians. This crime was held by a German court to be not anti-Semitic in a ruling upheld by an appeals court, but simply, and I'm quoting, an expression of anti-Israel protest. Given both the clear urgency and potentially long process, we decided that we would not write a new definition, but draw upon an existing one, and we chose for that purpose the definition that was known as the European Union Monitoring Center's working definition, a definition that had been around for about a decade, but had no official status. Dino is one of the drafters of that original text, might address some more about that, and Erwin also had background in his input into the text. So I took the existing text, and for the next 3 years, took it to the expert working groups in IHRA to build support, and Rob and colleagues like David Silberklein of Yad Vashem were instrumental in this effort. And when we had that support, we worked to build consensus among the diplomats who make the final political decisions in IHRA. Just to clarify, I'm sure you all understand, but when we say consensus, that means that everybody, every country, has to sign off on it. It is not a majority vote. It has to be unanimously accepted. And getting 30 countries together on an issue like this is not exactly a simple process. To make a long story short, and it was a very difficult process, the result was not certain until the last minute, but finally, thanks to the heroic efforts of the late Romanian chair of IHRA, Ambassador Mihnea Constantinescu, who is an unsung hero of all this, we achieved consensus and adopted a slightly revised text at the Bucharest plenary of June 2016, which then became the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism that we all know. So far for the history. Now some words about the definition itself. First of all, as Rob stressed, it's non-legally binding, which means, as we have both written elsewhere, that IHRA is, well, not a political or legal weapon. It is an educational resource. It does not define who is an anti-Semite or who is a Jew. Instead, it says there are certain manifestations of anti-Semitism, end quote. Thus, it targets actual actions or appearances of anti-Semitism and uses 11 examples as concrete illustrations of what anti-Semitism could be. And I emphasize could because it is also contextual, meaning, as the definition clearly states, again quoting, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, followed by the examples. This also recognizes that IHRA is not a type of legal code with a listing of prescribed activities. It is an educational or analytic tool that tells you not what you can say, but rather how you can, or perhaps shouldn't, say it. IHRA is also a working definition, by which is meant not a definition that is unfinished and waiting to be shaped into its final form, but rather an instrument that is meant to be meant for practical use, to be put to work. Those who claim to be able to amend it or simply drop the examples, which are the most controversial part of IHRA, because 7 of them can be viewed as calling out examples of anti-Zionism, are simply censoring IHRA to suit their own political agenda. IHRA also explicitly acknowledges, as Minister Lapid repeated the other night, and so many others have already stressed, that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. It essentially builds on Natan Sharansky's famous 3 Ds of anti-Zionism. Some critics of IHRA have claimed that the definition, and especially illustrative examples, forbid criticism of Israel and are a tool for censorship. This is absolutely false, and comes from those who have either failed to read the definition or intentionally distort its contents. IHRA's use as a practical tool, as examples we can see in the UK, when it was used to help illustrate the anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, the fact that it now used as a tool for by definition of the declaration of the Presidential Executive Order in the United States in 2019 on anti-Semitism, where it is now used on the website of the State Department, which suggests that our allies used it as well. It has been confirmed by President Biden, by Secretary Blinken, and most recently by Deputy Assistant Secretary Kara McDonald, who called it the gold standard in a recent conversation, adopted by international bodies like the OAS and European bodies, which other colleagues will speak about, and even is in play at the UN, where in a discussion I had with Miguel Angel Martinos, who was the UN's focal point on anti-Semitism, we discussed ways in which IHRA could be used in the UN context. One final note. Both IHRA definitions, Holocaust denial and distortion, should be used hand in hand. Adoption of one should lead to adoption of both. They are linked and both vital to the health of democratic society. As Yehuda Bauer has often pointed out, World War II and its accompanying carnage, including the Shoah, were fought because of anti-Semitism. The structures and concepts that grew out of World War II were based on the necessity of preventing any sort of repetition. These include organizations such as the UN or EU, or concepts like genocide, human rights, and war crimes. There's no coincidence that refugee Lemkin granted today. As Ahmed Shahid wrote, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy, while Holocaust denial and distortion are often used to undermine democratic civil society. IHRA and its definitions have become not only a vital tool that can protect Jews, but they also become essential for the defense of liberal democracy today.
Thank you. Next up, we have a speaker who's not only one of the foremost scholars in her field, but one of the drafters, as Mark said, of the definition. But more than that, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying, she's also one of the kindest and most giving academics I've had the pleasure to know. In addition to winning multiple awards for her scholarship, Dina Porat is head of the Cantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry, served as the head of the Department of Jewish Studies at Tel Aviv's Rosenberg School for Jewish Studies. But there's more, also chief historian at Yad Vashem since 2010, an expert on multiple international delegations, and was the senior academic advisor of the organization now known as the IHRA. Dina.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll do my best. Good morning, everyone. Very kind of you to be here at 9 o'clock and even earlier. And thank you all the organizers, and thank you, Chairman. I'll do my best to quetch my remarks into 7 minutes, and I'll continue more or less where Mark ended. Thank you for outlining the history, or part of the history, and I'd like to share with you a few points about the status and the meaning of the IHRA definition today. Okay? First of all, let me say that it is a working definition. Why is it called working? All many other definitions that you can find of anti-Semitism in any lexicon and in any encyclopedia are not working, are definitions. They are definitions that were written by academics, by those who were asked to, commissioned to. It is working because it is very short, it's a page and something, it is very clearly worded. It does not, if you take a good look at it, it does not delve into the complicated problems of who is a Jew, who is an anti-Semite, why is he an anti-Semite, what's the history of anti-Semitism, motivations, etc. No, it just says clearly in a sentence or two what is anti-Semitism, and then 2 or 3 principles, and then examples. So this is why it is a working definition, and this is why it could be really useful. Second point is that Mark mentioned and emphasized that it is not legally binding. It is not legally binding, which means that you cannot go to court with one of the examples someone did or spoke contrary to one of the examples in the definition. You cannot go to court with this. What you can do is that if there are laws in the country where it was perpetrated, you can, with the definition, help a suit and help the court if there is a law that is relevant. So it is not legally binding, and the criticisms that are recently leveled against the definition, that it goes against the freedom of speech, that it goes against the rights of Palestinians, which have no, as Deborah said yesterday, Ma'inyan Shmita leHar Sinai. It does not stand in the way of any other self-determination or self-definition, and it does not stand in the way of freedom of speech. Look around. They are criticizing Israel morning to night, outside Israel and inside Israel. So where exactly does it hamper or become an obstacle on the freedom of speech? It doesn't. Okay. One more point is regarding, third point, regarding the status today. We in the Country Center made an effort to map the adoption of the IHRA definition worldwide. And we reached the number recently of 450 states, universities, local councils, religious institutions, etc., sport clubs, but this is not a final number at all. Yesterday, I was quite surprised. You remember that we had here MP Christian Wakeford, did I say it rightly? Yeah, Wakeford. And he spoke about 100 universities in the UK alone. And we didn't number all these 100. 2 minutes, okay. Which means that the number is higher. And by our own efforts, we have already reached close to 500. That is to say, in other words, this working definition has an international status. It also has the support of many signatures, some hundreds of academics. As you know, there are criticisms and there are some, at least 2 or 3 new other definitions, and the debate about them goes mainly inside academic circles. They do not have yet, these new ones, they do not have yet any political or practical impact. They are there, and there is a debate around them. And I will finish, Chairman, don't worry, I will finish with saying 2 things shortly. One is that I believe that the debate only helps. Why is that? Because it opens a debate and the discussion, Rachel agrees with me, and the discussion of identity, freedom of speech, what is anti-Semitism, what are other evils, etc. It opens a debate. I highly recommend that you read the protocol of the French Assemblée Nationale dealing with the question of adoption and going down into all matters. So it is also an opening to debate, to discussions that are always helpful. I will finish by saying, Mark, you mentioned other definitions as well. That there are others and there should be more. I'm from Buenos Aires, football, and the Football Association of Argentina adopted the definition and asked all groups to adopt it. And what do I read? I read that they said that it is contra cualquier forma de odio, discriminación o racismo. זאת אומרת, against every form of hate, discrimination, or racism. And it goes against racistas or xenophobes, which means against racists and xenophobes. Doesn't mention anti-Semitism, doesn't mention Jews. Which means that the working definition is being adopted not just against anti-Semitism or Jews on a narrow level, but it is adopted in order to discuss everything, all evils, racism, xenophobia, hate, discrimination, etc.
Thank you, Dina. Sorry. Okay. We're going to move along expeditiously to our third speaker, who really needs no introduction, but he'll get one anyway. An international human rights lawyer, the Honorable Erwin Kotler is an emeritus professor of law at McGill University. He's also founder and international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and a longtime parliamentarian. But that's not all. In addition to this, He's a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. He is Canada's Special Envoy for Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, and a member of the Organization of American States Expert Legal Panel on Venezuela. Professor Kotler.
Thank you, Robert. And after the excellent presentations of my colleagues, Mark and Dina, what I'd like to do is just share with you some perspectives about, and including what they have been saying by reference, about the origin, the status, and the impact of IHRA and the working definition of anti-Semitism, which grew out of the founding of IHRA itself at the Stockholm conferences, where the Holocaust was regarded as a paradigm for radical evil and anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate. And I want to note the presence of Professor Yehuda Bauer, who in effect was one of the founding fathers of that process. Baruch haba Yehuda. So let me summarize these perspectives in a series of one-liners. Number one, the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism is the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international consensus definition that we have. But what is less well known is that it's also the most representative, that it was adopted after a 15-year democratic decision-making process involving intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, academics, and the like. As someone who was present at the creation, if I can use the term, at all four Stockholm conferences, and as a parliamentarian and Minister of Justice involved also with the EUMC drafting, I can attest to both the inclusive and representative character of the process, which led to its unanimous adoption then under the leadership of Mark Weitzman at the time 5 years ago. Two, the drafting of the IHRA definition, and this is not as well known as it deserves to be, concretized after the Durban Conference in 2001, where the first World Conference on Racism turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people. The IHRA definition began then as an antidote to the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism, which accounts for several of the illustrative metrics in the IHRA working definition, including the reference to Israel as a racist endeavor. Number three, the IHRA definition, and this too less well known than it deserves to be and how it must be utilized, is also anchored in and inspired by important parliamentary principles and precedents, including the London Declaration to Combat Anti-Semitism, adopted in 2009 at the Interparliamentary Conference, and the Ottawa Parliamentary Protocol in 2010, and a very unknown but very compelling unanimous resolution adopted by the Canadian Parliament, as one wag once said about Canada, cancelled for lack of interest. So very much what goes on in Canada, not as well known as it deserves to be. February 2015, that resolution stated, among other things, as follows, that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest, unanimously adopted by all members of Parliament. Number four, the IHRA definition was also anchored in and inspired by equality rights doctrine of equal protection and equal treatment before the law. And this is applicable both to traditional and the new anti-Semitism. To sum it up, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. In fact, sometimes the right even to live. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, old and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is it has moved from discrimination against the Jews as individuals to the discrimination against the Jews as a people, and reverted back to discrimination against Jews as individuals and as a people. Number five, IHRA was also anchored in, as Ahmed Shahid put it yesterday, in our international human rights treaty obligations, including the obligation to prohibit incitement to hostility, discrimination, and violence. Number 6, again, as Ahmed Shahid put it, anti-Semitism is an assault on the most fundamental of our rights, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, the right to freedom of religion, conscience, and belief, the right, as I mentioned, to equal protection of the laws. I can go on. But IHRA, in that sense, is a protective framework for both the framing and protecting of these rights. Number 7, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, the canary in the mine shaft of global evil, as Ahmed Shahid said yesterday. And as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so the importance of IHRA as a protective framework for democracies and democracy itself. Number 8, IHRA has been put forward in a false allegation, which is both uninformed and misleading, as silencing speech. It's the other way around. This false and misleading allegation turns law, history, and morality on its head. IHRA, in fact, is protective of speech. It is protective, for example, of the speech of students on the campuses who are disenfranchised, marginalized, excluded even from participation in the public discourse on the campuses. So it's protective of speech at the same time as it is protective of the rights of the Palestinian people. There's nothing in there that seeks to silence those rights. In fact, it's also protective of those rights. What it prevents against is the movement across the red line through the metrics illustrated there into the assault on free speech, as well as the assault on all other fundamental rights. And number 9, and moving to a close, this leads to the important metric that was mentioned. I won't go into it. Not only is IHRA a non-binding definition, not only is it an indispensable resource at this point, but it is a resource that can be called upon by all those who need to engage in it. In a word, as it's been said, if you can't define it, you can't combat it. And IHRA defines it and allows us to monitor and combat it. Number 10, we are witnessing, and we've heard this yesterday, and witnessing for some time, an old, new, escalating, global, virulent, sophisticated, and even lethal anti-Semitism. That's exploded both with respect to the dramatic increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes and the dramatic increase in incendiary hate speech. The IHRA definition is an indispensable asset for both. It's an indispensable asset, in a word, for governments, for parliaments, for justice officials, for law enforcement units, for media platforms, for academics, and the like. So in that sense, it's a kind of universal resource. Number 10, IHRA is also necessary to, in fact, unmask and expose the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values. The protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, and as I mentioned, the struggle against racism. As a Canadian for whom the UN is part of my DNA, human rights part of our foreign policy, international law indispensable to our identity, IHRA is indispensable to all of that. And finally, and for all of the above, we need to enhance the adoption and the implementation of the IHRA definition and its mainstreaming in all sectors of government, parliament, society, as I mentioned. This is particularly important because one of the worst things we are witnessing now is not only the dramatic escalation in anti-Semitism, but the mainstreaming, the normalizing, and the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture. IHRA is an antidote to all that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And during the discussion, I think we'll talk about some of the mainstreaming elements because that's very, very important. We're now going to move to the digital portion of our discussion, and I'm pleased to welcome, albeit remotely, the person who has proven to be one of the most important leaders in the history of the IHRA, Ambassador Michaela Kukler. She is Germany's special representative for relations with Jewish organizations and issues relating to anti-Semitism. And last year, between March of 2020 and March of 2021, she led the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance during Germany's presidency, a task made daunting by the COVID pandemic. Quite honestly, she and the permanent office of the IHRA kept the organization alive. And more than that, during her chairpersonship, led the IHRA as it adopted a working definition of anti-Roma discrimination, issued a statement against the rehabilitation of collaborators, and led us in the Global Task Force on Holocaust Distortion. Michaela, I think I see you on the screen. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Thank you very much, Rob, for this very friendly introduction. It touches my heart. Good morning, everybody. I would have loved to be with you, but this pandemic still prevents us from meeting personally. I'd like to thank also the organizers, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, for this very important conference. I think it is more important than ever to exchange views about anti-Semitism in the world globally and how to combat it. Thank you also to the previous speakers who said many important things already about the IHRA and about the working definition on anti-Semitism. I would like to add some more thoughts to their words. The IHRA is the only international institution that is bringing together experts from a variety of disciplines, non-governmental organizations, governments, and international organizations like the United Nations, like the UNESCO, like the European Union, to discuss issues of Holocaust remembrance, research, and education, and of the genocide of the Roma. So it has really a unique mandate in the world. The IHRA's work, and what makes it so valuable, is that it is open in dialogue. It is it is steeped in open dialogue, in cooperation, and in consensus building. This way of working, combined with the interdisciplinary and international expertise, means that the tools it develops have broad applicability and political backing. Both are important. The IHRA, among the IHRA's tools, there are the three working definitions that were already mentioned. The working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion of 2013, which has become more important, unfortunately, during the last few years. Then in 2016, the IHRA adopted in consensus the working definition of anti-Semitism, which is of interest for us today. And in 2020, the non-legally binding working definition of anti-Gypsyism, anti-Roma discrimination. These working definitions not only guide the IHRA in its work to advance Holocaust education, remembrance, and research worldwide, but they were, and they are, and they will be crucially to the fight against these dangerous phenomena. I would like to make 3 points why these definitions are so important. Firstly, they raise awareness. Secondly, they facilitate monitoring. And finally, they empower. Let me come to my first point. The working definitions help educate and sensitize people to these phenomena of anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion. With the help of the working definitions, we can learn about some of the various ways they can manifest themselves. Anti-Semitism can manifest itself. And there's one thing that is really important about the definitions, which has been discussed a lot, and those are the examples, which are part of the definitions. The examples are so important because they refer to real world issues. They provide clear guidance to help identify anti-Semitism. Secondly, the working definition help facilitate tracking and monitoring efforts by providing monitoring organizations with a consistent way of identifying anti-Semitism. Let me just give you one example, and that is a study published by recently by the European Commission, together with the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, on the rise of anti-Semitism online during the pandemic, which was very significant, as we all know. After looking at over 4 million French and German language posts, researchers found that during the pandemic, there was a 7-fold increase in the use of anti-Semitic postings in the French language and a 13-fold increase in the German language posts. The study provides us with valuable insight into the effect of the pandemic on anti-Semitism, and it shows us the role of online platforms in spreading hate and just how large this international problem has become. This is perhaps an issue for discussion later on, and what we can do about it. But it also shows us the impact of the IHRA working definition, because it was used by the researchers as a guideline to identify channels containing anti-Semitic content and and to classify anti-Semitic expressions. So there really it served as a useful tool. Finally, and for me, this is the most important point about the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, it empowers people. The working definition never was meant to be an academic exercise, but it was meant for daily use. It was meant to be a practical tool to allow also non-experts to meaningfully engage in the fight against anti-Semitism. We saw this, for instance, with anti-Semitic and racist chanting from right-wing hooligan groups at football matches, for example. Just a couple of days ago in the European Championship finals between Italy and England, the leaders of football clubs draw from it the conclusion that they needed a tool to identify anti-Semitism in order to be able to construct educational programs to combat it. And that is why so many football clubs throughout Europe adopted the IHRA working definition as the basis for further action. But it was not only individual football clubs, but also football organizations. Dina Porat already mentioned the Asociación Fútbol Argentino, but also the English Premier League and the German Bundesliga adopted the IHRA working definition as a basis for their educational programs to combat anti-Semitism and to foster a more inclusive culture in football. One more point, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, of Holocaust denial, of anti-Gypsyism, they are a starting point for further tools of the IHRA, which have been developed throughout the years or are in the course of being developed. Maybe this is also a point for discussion later on, and I'm willing to extend more on that. To conclude, we know that Holocaust denial and distortion, anti-Semitism, and anti-Roma discrimination all attack the very heart of our liberal democracies and of our inclusive and pluralistic societies. These are issues that transcend linguistic and national borders. Countering them is everybody's responsibility, not only law enforcement bodies, but also an individual obligation. What the working definitions do, and this has been said before, but I would like to underline it once again, is to open up a discussion around these topics. And this is critical to building a broad and strong coalition to counter these worrying trends. The working definitions have guided the IHRA's work to advance Holocaust education, remembrance, and research worldwide. And they have provided an essential starting point for fight against dangerous trends in our societies. The IHRA's working definitions are practical tools, not academic exercises. Their real impact is in their empowering effect in how they foster a world in which anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and distortion, and anti-Gypsyism, anti-Roma discrimination don't have a place. In how they lay the foundation for a world that remembers the Holocaust, for a world without genocide. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kukler. For those of us joining us virtually, it's very hard to signal you from Jerusalem. So I will have to interrupt. If the microphone's out, I may have to jump in front of the camera and wave my arms like a madman, but we do need to keep to time. We're going west from Germany to Brussels. Our fifth speaker, Katharina von Schnurbein, is known to many of us for having made an indelible and positive impact on the EU's effort to fight anti-Semitism. We know, but I will remind you that she was appointed as the first European Commission coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. I think that was in December of 2015, so she's been at this a while. Her significant policy background is matched by scholarly expertise in the field, as shown by the remarkable output and development of new programs and initiatives under her leadership. Katharina, if you please.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good morning to all. Like Michael, I would prefer to be with you, but this is how it is at the moment. I'll give you a brief overview how the European Commission, the European Union has been using the IHRA definition. And in fact, we at the Commission started using it in January 2017, already before we became then in 2018 permanent international partners for the EU as a whole. Actually, I have to say, when I arrived in this position, I was surprised that the EU was not already a permanent international partner, and I think it only made sense to intensify this cooperation, which we have since done, I think, in a very productive and very hands-on manner. We wanted to use the different structures there are in order to establish the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism before the backdrop of everything that has been said, the fact that you need to define it and recognize anti-Semitism in order to fight it and so on. Apart from starting to use it in the European Commission in January 2017, it was then passed at European Parliament in 2017 in June in a formal resolution, and it is the reference into Council conclusions, declarations. The Council is the representative body of the member states of the EU in 2018 and again 2020. So that was an important aspect, to really use the formal structures that there are to establish the IHRA definition as the reference point when it comes to addressing anti-Semitism. In fact, yesterday we had a debate in the European Parliament with regards to the upcoming first ever strategy on anti-Semitism on EU level that will be adopted in October this year. And it will build heavily on the IHRA definition for, on the one side, anything that has to do with online anti-Semitism and addressing anti-Semitism in the different forms, hate speech on the one side, but also disinformation and conspiracy myths and the harmful content that is below the hate speech threshold, but can in very concrete terms also lead to hate crime. And the other aspect is the data collection and the recording, and therefore to make anti-Semitism visible in order to increase the also political will of understanding that anti-Semitism as such is on the rise, is becoming more visible, but also the link to the threat to democracy that has already been alluded to as well. And in that debate yesterday in Parliament, there was an MEP who said, 20 years ago, I participated in the AJC conference in Berlin. And at that time, it was very difficult to render home to the general public that there was an issue with rising anti-Semitism from within migrant communities with regards to Israel. And the two issues that still today are complicated, but because of the IHRA definition actually have been framed. And I think this has been very important in that regard. And he acknowledged that there has been enormous progress also with regards and because of this tool. We know that from our survey that we did in 2018 among 16,500 Jews in Europe, that the examples resonate with what the large majority of Jewish community representatives sees as anti-Semitic. And I think this is important to have this victims-based and rights-based approach at the center of our policies. Then we know, of course, that adoption is very important, yes, but most importantly is the use of it. So together with the IHRA, we published in January this year a handbook on the practical use of the IHRA definition, which is based on incidents that really happened in the EU or in the UK, and then best practices on how the IHRA definition is used already in within the EU and the UK with regards to specific areas, education, law enforcement, data collection. And I think this can help national authorities, but also civil society, journalists, universities, institutions, parties to apply it in a very concrete way. And this is, in fact, the most important, to use it in societal debate. As with regards to the other definition, which is less known, but very important as well, it's important to recognize that Holocaust denial and trivialization is already criminalized across the EU since 2008. And the importance, again, is the enforcement. The European Commission has now started infringement procedures for lack of transposition or wrong transposition of these aspects against 10 member states. This is an important legal tool that we have where we see now gradually member states, because of these infringement procedures, are starting to change their legislation to criminalize Holocaust denial and trivialization. With regards to distortion, things are of course much more complicated. And here I think that the non-legally binding definition by the IHRA can be very helpful, again, when it comes also in particular to the online world, but also offline and in the media. And the practical guidance that was issued, I believe, should really be amplified with regards to civil society discussions. It's really important to explain the aspects of Holocaust distortion that are often below the hate speech threshold, but are still very harmful.
Thank you. Yes,
Yes. Yeah, I think that, in fact, I think I've said most of the important things. So in order to keep to time, voila.
I appreciate it very much. And I do apologize for this. It's a night of 1,000 stars, so I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity. Continuing westward, we're going to next hear from the person, and again, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, who in many ways has revitalized British engagement with issues related to the Holocaust and to the scourge of anti-Semitism. Lord Eric Pickles was a long-time MP, and for many years, I think also since 2015, has been the UK's special envoy on post-Holocaust issues. In addition to that, he's presently co-chairing the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, which will lead to an exciting new center located next to the Houses of Parliament, and he was made a life peer in 2018. Lord Pickles.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to see so many good friends, albeit virtually, and look forward to the day when we can all be reunited in person. I was pretty proud to be there at the adoption of the definition by the IHRA plenary. It was an important day for IHRA, but it was a far more important day in the battle against prejudice and bigotry. In a relatively short time, it's been established as the international standard definition applied by countless institutions and countries. It's proved to be very effective. And because of that effectiveness, it has faced very fierce opposition. As you know, we're proud that the UK was the first country in the world to adopt the definition. All our major political parties have now adopted it. 2/3 of all local authorities, 649 MPs out of 650 have adopted it. The one that has failed to adopt it doesn't sign anything, and apparently he thinks that's important. Our Crown prosecution services adopted it, so has the police service and an increasing number of universities. And thanks to my mate, Lord Mann, football clubs in the UK and across Europe have also adopted it. The fact that the legal definition is not legally binding is an enormous strength. It allows for easy adoption. It does not require legislation, nor does it change existing laws. It respects differences between free speech and hate speech. The fact that it is a working definition is also a strength because it acknowledges that the lists of examples are not exhaustive and takes on the abroad that as anti-Semitism morphs and mutates, there is possibilities that other examples may emerge over time. But the adoption is just the first step. We now need to focus on how the working definition of anti-Semitism is being applied. In the UK, we use the definition in full. The examples are the key. They give a clear indication of how anti-Semitism can manifest itself in the 21st century. The examples are a test of the atmosphere, if you like, a barometer of how the issues described in the example impact on Jewish communities. I'd like to share just a couple of examples of how we've used the definition. Our criminal justice service and the police see the definition as a useful guide to identify, for example, the different types of anti-Semitism and its language that may be used in any given incident. Ofcom, which is the UK's government's communication regulator, used the IHRA working definition when making its findings against the Islamic Channel, an English language satellite television channel broadcast in 136 countries worldwide, including the UK. The decision related to an episode of a program called The Rightly Guided Caliphs. Ofcom used many of the examples cited in the definition to reach the decision. The definition needs to be used as we need to share best practice and examples of how different institutions have used the definition to ensure that we challenge anti-Semitism wherever it raises its ugly head. Now, of course, that's a given. But a few things need to be put on the table. I am intrigued why a definition of anti-Semitism, which has the support and the trust of the victims, is criticized by people who have never experienced it. I am disturbed by a campaign of deliberate misrepresentation of the definition, which suggests it constrains academic freedom. This is clearly not the case. It is barely credible to suggest that a non-legally binding definition can constrain anything, let alone academic freedom. The definition acknowledges that proportionate criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. It is surely not beyond the wit of our greatest minds to be able to criticize Israel without lapsing into anti-Semitic tropes. I believe an attempt to reopen the debate on the definition is harmful. We're talking about real people who have been victimized today, The Community Security Trust have released figures, a well-respected organization which monitors anti-Semitism, led by friends of many people in this room, Mark Gardner. It recorded 628 incidents of anti-Semitism from the 8th of May to the 17th of June, during and after the recent conflicts between Israel and Gaza.
1 minute.
The record wave of anti-Jewish hate was accompanied by violent rhetoric and extreme incidents online and anti-Semitic demonstrations. To understand the unprecedented number of incidents, you only have to compare it to the 146 incidents that took place over a similar period. The targeting of Jewish neighborhoods seemed to have, in my mind, been orchestrated and seemed to have occurred right across the globe. Similarly, many of the chants which represented rallies persisted across the world. It's because we're talking about the impact of anti-Semitism on people's lives, on grandparents, parents, and children. We must not be distracted by the debate on alternative definitions. While many contributions to addressing the scourge of anti-Semitism are welcome, and the Jerusalem Declaration is no exception, the United Kingdom view is that the declaration is unlikely to replace the IHRA definition, which is now universally the preferred text. That said, we need to acknowledge that while some of the signatures to the Jerusalem Declaration are respected scholars, others are not, and are persons who have emerged as conspiracy theorists like Richard Falk. I believe it would be a mistake and detrimental to reopen any debate on the definition. Far better that we should concentrate our efforts on attacking the symptoms and the causes of anti-Semitism. And the best way to do this is by first adopting the IHRA definition and then, more importantly, to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Pickles. We have stopped our westward journey because we're going to stay in Great Britain. It's encouraging that the British have not only the work of Lord Pickles to rely upon, but also the significant efforts of Lord John Mann. Lord John Mann of Holbeck Moor is Her Majesty's government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism, and before that was an elected member of Parliament between 2001 and 2019. He has a deep background in the field, and if you follow him on social media, you know his commitment to this challenge is, quite frankly, unshakable and a model to many of us. So, Lord Mann, if you please, the floor is yours for the next 7 minutes.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And my message to the Global Forum is, let's not be defensive about IHRA and about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. The time for intellectual arguments and discussion is over. There is no half definition. There is no alternative. There is a settled definition. And the only question is, are people prepared to use it? You can't uninvent it. It's there. So are people prepared to adopt it? And what we are finding is that the definition is a practical tool. And it's the whole point about the definition. The definition isn't something to be passed by some vote, ticking the box where it sits there in policy documents. It's to be used day in, day out, and that's exactly how we are seeing it succeeding. So when Lord Pickles says that every political party in the UK has adopted it, the political parties in the UK are using it for sanction, for education, for challenging attitudes, sometimes for getting rid of people. And that's best done where possible, effectively, silently, with no hullabaloo. Sometimes it breaks out into the public domain. But part of our great success in using it is the vast majority of times it's used. Actually, it's not in the media. You don't know about it because it's been used effectively to pull someone up, to explain to them, to re-educate them why what they're saying is unacceptable, why it's damaging. why it's disempowering for people in the Jewish community. That's the essence of a working definition. That's exactly how they're using it. So when I trained a group of local political leaders in East London last week, in detail, answering hugely detailed questions about anti-Semitism and about how to use the IHRA definition, we didn't do a press release, we didn't broadcast that. We didn't do it on a public forum, but it was hugely effective. That's how football wants to use it. That's how the universities want to use it. I've met with every single UK university that has adopted the definition, and with those that are about to do so. And we will reach, in the near future, nearly 100% saturation of our universities using the IHRA definition. And in that, I explained to the university leaders that this isn't something for some vote in a university, for some long intellectual debate. It's about two things: the empowerment of the Jewish student and the ability of the Jewish student to be themselves, to identify as Jewish in the way that they choose to do so, to articulate that, to be proud to be so, with no impediment, no shunning, no ostracization, no abuse, nothing but the empowerment to be themselves, and knowing that their university now has a mechanism that they can use that's available for the outside world to see. If anyone in any way tries to impede on their identity, to me, that's what empowerment is about. If you're a young Jewish footballer, male or female, be it professional footballer, be it amateur, be it schools and youths, the use of the IHRA definition empowers you to have a route to do something about it if you face any hostility, any impediment, any ostracization. That's why it's so important that we take this into civic society. We'll have another announcement next week about precisely how we're going to oversee its use across English football. We agreed 2 weeks ago a programme to take this into Scottish football for the first time. And we'll discuss far more under the session later with Chelsea about this issue. But for those who are elsewhere, then let me tell you, 11th of November, we'll have an important conference in Vienna with the support of Chelsea Football Club and the Austrian Jewish community on best practice in tackling anti-Semitism in football. For us, this is what this is about: practical, effective, empowering, sharing that best practice. This is a working definition, not a policy that sits there in the record books. So my plea, let's work together more effectively to put this definition to work in every corner of all societies. And if we do so, particularly those young Jewish people who are ostracized, who are disempowered, who are abused, they will see the huge benefits through the empowerment that this gives them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mann, and thank you to all of the panelists, especially for your patience with me serving as clock watcher. We are going to dispense with the internal dialogue and I think turn it over for questions for the sake of time. I've been told we have an additional 10 minutes, for which I'm very, very grateful. As we turn it over to the audience here in person and that online, I think it's important to maybe summarize some of the points we learned because we've heard from so many people. And I'd like to start by something that was said actually at the very top. This was a definition that was born out of necessity. And what we have seen since the adoption of the definition in 2016 is a perhaps confused understanding of the necessity that's before us. The necessity was, I believe Lord Pickles said this, to begin to address the very fact that we are dealing with real people who are being victimized in real life, not just victimized, but viciously attacked and in some cases killed. This is a practical tool, and debating terms, what we like and don't like, is a luxury of times of peace, a time that we are unfortunately not in. So as you frame your questions, I ask that you consider that. I ask you also to consider the educational good that can come out of the IHRA definition. The fact that for the vast majority of people outside of this room, anti-Semitism is not something they think about on a regular basis. How can we use IHRA, the IHRA working definition, I should say, to teach them about what anti-Semitism is and how to recognize it in their midst? So with that, I think we'll start here on the floor, and if there are any questions from the world of Zoom, I may see a hand or two there.
Boker Tov, good morning. I'm Rochelle Kaplan from Yad Vashem. Just two very short points. One is regarding the IHRA working definitions. I think it's very important to keep in mind that these definitions take the victim's perspective into account, and of course I've taken that from you, Rob, so I can't take credit for that, but I think it is an important point, both having to do with anti-Semitism and of course anti-Roma sentiment. Second thing is I just want to point out, we talk a lot about the IHRA definition. Of course, IHRA's main focus, of course, is Holocaust remembrance, research, and education. I sometimes often miss the former name of IHRA, the ITF, International Task Force, because the task is not over. And I think we talked a lot about empowering today, but it's, of course, teaching about anti-Semitism and empowering people about it is important. It is also important in parallel to empower professionals about Holocaust awareness and what it means, especially educators. And I think we have to keep that in mind because that's really our focus. Thank you.
Perhaps the panelists have comment either online or in the room? No? Maybe we'll...
Sure, I have, if you can take me, Rob. I think we're in an interesting world where people, where the traditional Holocaust denier is not as influential as Holocaust distortion. And I think we're moving into the historic age where I think colleagues have commented to me that we're moving to an age of indifference, whereby the immediacy of 6 million just floats into history. So I think it's going to require a much more important shift in the way in which the Holocaust is taught to ensure that the truth of the Holocaust is heard. I mean, it's particularly important when we arrive at a point where the last Holocaust survivor is no longer with us, because there will be a big reassessment of history then. And it's going to be important for us to be able to hold on to the truth. Holocaust distorters can lie and misrepresent as much as they like. We've got a higher standard to ensure that the truth of the Shoah is held. And that's one of the reasons why the United Kingdom is building a new memorial to the Holocaust right next to Parliament. And we'll have a learning centre that will critically examine the decisions of the British government during that period.
I think we'll hear from Professor Porat, Ambassador Kukler, and then take another question from the group. Did Erwin have
thank you, Rochelle, for your comments. And let me draw your attention to the following. In the criticisms against the working definition of the IHRA, there is no mentioning of the IHRA as such. What is the IHRA? It's now the definition is called to be short. It is called to be IHRA, the IHRA definition. But no one speaks. And this, I think, is a proof of the ignorance that still goes around it. You know, I know for sure that many of those who signed the other attempt of a definition have not read it. They have not read what they signed, and they have not read the original definition, which brings us indeed to the point mentioned by Lord Pickles, that we should do a lot to have the definition known among many, because still it is being said, you know, but as a slogan, but it's not fully enough known.
Ambassador Kukler will speak, then we'll take a question here, and I believe there's one on the other side of the room later. So Ambassador Kukler, please.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with what Michelle just said about the focus of the IHRA, which is remembrance of the Holocaust, education and research about the Holocaust. And Holocaust distortion really has become an important issue to combat during the last 5, 7, 8 years. And that is also the reason why during the German presidency of the IHRA, we established a global task force to combat against Holocaust distortion, of which you, Rob, were a part, like others from experts from the IHRA. And this global task force, they have published recommendations for policy and decision makers how to recognize and how to identify and combat Holocaust distortion. But it doesn't stop with the recommendations. There will be educational material joined to it, like short videos who explain why it is so important to combat Holocaust distortion, because eventually it leads to anti-Semitic expressions. And there is this big social media campaign that was launched together with the European Commission, with the United Nations, with UNESCO, Protect the Facts, to counter Holocaust distortion. So I really think that we have to focus also on the issue of Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust distortion. Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am.
Jana Grinch from Sorbonne Nouvelle University. I have a very short and a concrete question. Well, you know, in France we have a rebirth of anti-Semitism, Jews are attacked on the streets, and many complaints stay without any response from the police. No one ever heard about IHRA definition, maybe in some institutional, high-level ministries, yes, but no one really knows about that. So the question is very concrete and maybe naive. How are you going to implement the IHRA definition to all these institutions? How is the police going to be informed about that? So what is the concrete application of this debate?
Volunteers to answer that question.
First of all, France, as a member of IHRA, has known about IHRA for quite a long time. Since its adoption in 2016, President Macron has addressed the issue directly and announced his support for it. There was a debate in the National Assembly. It actually came under attack in a prominent letter written by, I think, 24 or so Palestinian supporters, academics. I don't remember the exact number. It may have been more than that in recent last year, and a positive response authored by a number of academics and intellectuals. So there was a debate in the public press. So I don't think I could necessarily say that IHRA is necessarily unknown in any of the countries that we're talking about. The question of implementation, though, is much more important. Really, IHRA is not a magic wand that you wave it and anti-Semitism automatically disappears. I think we've gotten the sense from listening to a lot of the people, a lot of the adoptions by certain countries, that it's almost a political checkoff that serves to kind of qualify you for admittance into Western democracies by saying you're fighting anti-Semitism, we adopt IHRA, poof, everything is perfect. That is far from the case. I think you raised a very appropriate question, appropriate point, which is that implementation, as all of us have said, is the key issue with IHRA. You cannot just adopt it and expect to have it trickle down to, well, in the United States, we found out that trickle-down economics didn't work a long time ago. So you can't expect it to trickle down to police, to education, and so on without active efforts to implement it. So that's going to take involvement, and it also involves civil society demanding. I'm firm belief that political leadership sometimes is necessary and helpful, but quite often leadership flows downward up, where pressure is put on. You have established Jewish bodies, CRIF and others. You have the Fundación, which is certainly involved with IHRA's work, who can do and should be partners in this effort.
Robert?
Just, your question also just prompts me to say that that's the reason why Canada is holding a national action summit, an emergency summit on July 21st to combat anti-Semitism in the presence of the Prime Minister and all relevant government ministers to be involved in developing an action plan to implement, among other things, IHRA. And so we will have government ministers, parliamentarians from all parties, civil servants, NGOs, leaders of Jewish community organizations, academics, and the like. And the whole idea is that this is not to be a seminar, it's to be an action summit, and to come up with an action plan to then be implemented and to hopefully do some of the things that you mentioned yourself.
And
Robert?
Katarina von Schnurbein, please.
Yes, thank you. I wasn't sure whether you can hear me or not. I just wanted to say training is, of course, key with regards to law enforcement authorities, for example, but also teachers, journalists, and so on. So what we are doing now is to use European funding also through the structures that we have, for example, with regards to judicial training that already exists in other fields, to ensure that on the basis of the IHRA definition, such training can happen across the EU. Concretely, with regards to France, following the announcement or the adoption by the president, the DILCRA, the delegation on combating racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia, issued a decree towards the ministries of justice, for example, but also higher education and education, to ensure that they start using the IHRA definition. But I agree with Mark that it just simply also takes time for this to trickle down. The important aspect, I believe, is to use the existing structures that there are for training in other areas, and use those for training on the basis of the IHRA. And that's why we also created this handbook together with the IHRA to give these very concrete examples on how this can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Zuroff.
I think all of us greatly appreciate the efforts that were invested to get the IHRA definition passed and its importance. And I also think that obviously the focus now on distortion is very important, but I have a question for all of you, which is that everything in IHRA is done by consensus. You have countries who signed that definition and are busy distorting the Shoah for years, and it doesn't appear as if there's any indication that they have intentions to change. How are we going to deal with that?
Well, no, it's not only me. I'm watching the screen to see if anybody wants to join in. I am just the moderator, please. I mean, I have my opinions. I couldn't add if nobody else speaks.
Okay, that really gets to the crux of the problem: is how do you deal with countries that sometimes claim to be democracies, whether liberal or illiberal democracies, and yet engage in acts of Holocaust distortion or turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism and so on. A lot of what happens at IHRA is not necessarily public, but IHRA has had an impact in some of the countries where we have significant issues related to this. There have been missions, high-level diplomatic missions to these countries. What IHRA can effectively do is engage the political level and the political elite of the countries involved, using the information and background provided by the experts who feed and hopefully influence the political level associated with IHRA to have an impact back home in those countries. IHRA can present a united front against the country. In other words, saying that something is going on in this country, and if there are 34 member states, have 33 other members join in expressing their concern urgently about events taking place in a country, whether it is construction of a problematic museum, whether it is a law that is highly questionable, whether it is activities going on in construction of statues or memorials and so on. And IHRA has had some significant impacts in that, and sometimes it's negative. It's similar to what an Israeli diplomat once said to me about the UN. It's not necessarily what you see happening, it's what it prevented from happening that's important. So IHRA is significant, and the fact that the definitions have also now achieved great political support. Honestly, when both definitions were adopted by IHRA, I had no idea that they would gain the political traction and acceptance and international, just political, that they've achieved today. It is far beyond, I think, really the dreams of any of us who participated in that process. The fact that they have, and they are now a matter of public policy on the highest levels, the United States, the UK, all the countries that we've talked about so far, is extraordinarily significant. We now have tools on the record that can be used to put pressure on countries to significantly change aspects of their approach to the Holocaust and remembrance and to the anti-Semitism.
Ambassador Kukler, I would like you to speak next. I should note in the chat, you referenced the work of the German Foreign Ministry every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day to remind people of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism and how to apply it in various training programs. Maybe you can elaborate on that, and I'm sure you have other points as well.
Yeah, well, I thank you. I wanted simply to answer to the last question. I think the key is monitoring developments in the individual IHRA member countries, and then addressing it at different occasions. There is there are two very important monitoring instruments the IHRA has at hand. One is the so-called country reporting. It comes up every 10 or 15 years for each individual country, so that's not really short-term instrument, but the IHRA has two plenary meetings every year in spring and in winter, and that is also an occasion to address these issues. But as Mark Weitzman said, the discussions of IHRA are not always public, and that may give perhaps an impression that difficult issues are not being addressed. And yes, referring to your question, Rob, we have introduced actually this year in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Federal Foreign Office, a circular note that is going to be reminded automatically every year in the ministry in Berlin and in all the embassies and general consulates worldwide on 27th of January, Holocaust Remembrance Day, citing the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism and reminding every staff member to watch out, to detect anti-Semitism, and as soon as they detect it, to confront it. We published it this year, so the first time it will be circulated again will be next year. And well, we hope that we can, through this small instrument, contribute to liberate us from this scourge, which we see almost globally. Thank you.
I'm going to leave the last two comments first to Professor Porat, and as soon as she concludes, to Lord Pickles, and then we will take a break. So, Dina.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ephraim, for your question and for all the other questions. All of them pinpointed the problem. Let me say the following. We have seen, while mapping the adoption of the IHRA definition, that the more it is adopted, the more there is criticism. And it has been adopted at a much higher rate or pace during the last year and a half, which are the most difficult ones. And at parallel to that, criticism arose. Now, how is this related to your question? The IHRA works unanimously. You know that Professor Bauer has been a kibbutznik more than 40 years, and every other end of Shabbat, Motzai Shabbat, the kibbutz gathers to have these decisions. And in many of the kibbutzim, they should be unanimous. So the IHRA goes by a unanimous decision, which makes it difficult indeed to convince everyone. Another important point is that there is a clear distinction between experts in the IHRA who work in the working groups and the diplomats who are sitting around the table in the plenary. And the problem is, how can the experts who really know the material, bring the facts, affect the diplomats and give them tools in order to have the right answers? Now, many of the countries that you are referring to support Israel.
I know. We have a minute and we have Lord Pickles.
Okay, and since they support Israel, they are for the definition. Hungary adopted the definition and obliged all institutions to accept it. But how is it implemented? This is something that the IHRA cannot control.
We can continue that in the
just
hallway. I would
out of
like to give
control.
Lord Pickles an opportunity since he's not here in person. So we'll conclude with that. Lord P.
Yeah, Mark is right. We have had a number of successes, but it does remain a fire bell in the night. While we operate by consensus, most that movement of extreme nationalism that's occurring, of people wanting to rewrite history and suggest it was all the Nazis that were involved in anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and see themselves as victims. I think there may come a time, and I think that time is not too distant, when the various haranguing that we've given to various countries, that they might ignore it. And when that does arrive, I hope that IHRA will have the courage. I'm confident that IHRA will have the courage to address countries that simply refuse to recognize the facts.
Thank you all very much, and we will continue the conversation.
יוגב, הסרטון.
I want to thank the organizers of
Hi,
this
everybody.
forum.
Before we continue,
I'm
Yogev,
honored
אתה יכול
to
לעצור
be
רגע?
among some of the leading thinkers.
Before we continue with our next session, we have a special video message from Ambassador Ronald S. Lauder, the President of the World Jewish Congress. Thank you.
I want to thank the organizers of this forum, and I'm honored to be among some of the leading thinkers of the Jewish world today. Our topic, anti-Semitism. That's a discussion we Jews have had for more than 2,000 years. We thought about it, discussed it, fought against it, and yet it never goes away. What makes today's anti-Semitism different is that it comes from new sources, and part of the blame falls on our shoulders. For the first 2 decades after the Holocaust, when the world saw the photos of the gas chambers and the piles of bodies, no one in their right mind wanted to be associated with the Nazis. And those days, Israel was the startup nation that the world watched in wonder. It not only survived against all odds, it thrived, and it made diaspora Jews so proud. We were one people, and we cared about each other. But in the 1980s, Israel's enemies came up with a new tactic. They could not destroy Israel militarily. They could not destroy Israel economically. So they started a new form of destruction. They would destroy Israel politically. And Israel's enemies had some willing partners: the United Nations, universities and colleges, many in the international press, and the electronic media. And now, even more powerful platform over the last 20 years, the internet. And these willing partners had tremendous influence, especially over our children and grandchildren. Israel was cast as a colonial apartheid state. The Palestinians became the downtrodden, occupied people. In a way, they became David, and now Israel was Goliath. Israel allowed its enemies to define it. Israel did not respond. At the same time, when in the diaspora did not see the rising challenge, or we did not take it seriously. That was another mistake. So today, Israel has become the new excuse for the old anti-Semitism, and our enemies have free reign because there has been no commensurate response from Israel. 20 years ago, in a speech I gave in Jerusalem, I said that if Israel put money for one F-16 fighter into Hasbara, it could win this political war. But 20 years later, almost no money was put into Hasbara, and the situation has grown worse. Let me be straight with you. The seventh global form of anti-Semitism will have the same results as the previous six. A lot of words with no results. Today's fight against anti-Semitism is a war, no less consequential than the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War. The survival of Israel and the Jewish people is at stake. We must be united as one people. In a war, you can't be divided. That's a sure way to lose. We must put aside our petty differences. We must be one people. As president of the World Jewish Congress, I have traveled to over 40 countries to meet with Jewish communities. All of them told me that they feel that Israel had ignored them. But now they're excited that a new government will change this direction. The Jewish communities throughout the diaspora are excited and 100% behind Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And they look at his leadership and his willingness to work together with the Jewish diaspora. They also told me how pleased they are that Minister Lapid is rebuilding the foreign ministry. I believe Yair Lapid will be a great foreign minister, and I believe he should create a strong public relations and information division that will define the true Israel and not leave it up to our enemies. The challenges Israel and all Jews face today are enormous. Yes, our enemies are strong. They come from the left now as well as the right. They are well funded, and they have their very influential and willing partners. But Israel has survived challenges before. We must remember this. This is a very important, since the world now sees the Palestinians as a downtrodden and occupied people, the same way they once correctly saw Jews oppressed by its neighbors. They even were able to make Hamas look like Haganah. That is because the real purpose of Hamas has never been correctly defined. One way to combat this is to create two states for two people, a prosperous Israel alongside a prosperous Palestinian state. Finally, a stunning news item came out today in the media. A news report shows that a quarter of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state, and 9% believe Israel has no right to exist. That's 9% of American Jews. My guess is that they are mostly young Jews. We could not have a more clear example of the influence of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish haters teaching in colleges over the past decade. This is the new battlefield. Israel's new government must fight this now with all the power it has at its disposal, just as it fought its enemies on the plains of Sinai and the hills of Golan. We, the diaspora, must help as well. Trust me on this. The stakes are just too high at this moment in our history to not do this. The Jews in the diaspora are strongly behind the new government. We need new government to be strongly behind the diaspora. Thank you. Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you very much to Ronald Lauder for those words. I am honored and delighted to call to the stage Ambassador Noam Katz, here from the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with Professor Yehuda Bauer. Welcome. I'm sure all of you know Professor Yuda Bauer by now, so nothing really needs to be said about this incredible man, and we're delighted to have him here with us today with Ambassador Noam Katz so that we can all learn from his experiences with anti-Semitism.
Thank you. It is our honor and privilege to host you today, Professor Bauer, and we are happy with the opportunity that we have to learn from your vast experience and wisdom. And as we don't have long time, I would like to open with one very broad question, and then after you answer, I will continue with questioning, or we will allow some people from the audience to ask questions. My first question to you is, are you identifying new shapes, forms, and trends of anti-Semitism, and what are the best possible ways to counter them?
Well, first of all, not to defend. There's no point in defending Jews. If you tell people that how many Nobel Prize winners are Jewish, there's absolutely no impact on anyone. And the Jews are a small minority in the world's population. Of course, they are the butt of the attack. They are the ones who are being denied a proper equality. They occupy, and especially Israel, occupies the position of a Jew in medieval times when she was discriminated against and persecuted. And today, Israel is the collective Jew of the Middle Ages. But you see, there's something beyond that. The beyond that actually involves IHRA, because one of the decisions that IHRA took was to engage in the collaboration and support of attempts worldwide to fight genocide and genocidal massacres and mass atrocity crimes. That was a decision taken by IHRA. And I think this implies that the working definition of IHRA is actually more than the working definition of IHRA. It is a sign, a symbol for something that is both very, very specific and very, very universal. Because you see, the point is this: anti-Semitism is a danger to the societies in which it spreads. Of course, the immediate target are the Jews. But societies that have anti-Semitism spreading in them are in danger of being sick and dying of cancer. The Holocaust is an excellent example of that, of course, an extreme example. Not only the Holocaust was motivated by anti-Semitism. Nazi policies in World War II, the very decision to start a war, as documents prove, was motivated by the desire to fight an invented international Jewish conspiracy. It says so in documents, as my late friend Raoul Hilberg used to say, documents. Millions of people died because of World War II, non-Jews. 35 million people died in Europe alone in World War II. And about 29 million were non-Jews. And they died in part, at least, because of Jew hatred, which we call anti-Semitism. Is that not reason enough for the non-Jewish world to fight anti-Semitism? Is that not something that IHRA and our allies all over the world should concentrate on and explain. Many people already understand it. If you don't fight anti-Semitism, you are an enemy of your own people. Never mind the Jews, of your own people. Anti-Semitism in the United States, in Western society generally, eats the inner organs of the societies. Anti-Semitism spreads only in so-called monotheistic societies. It doesn't exist in polytheistic societies. Polytheistic societies are, after all, the majority of the world population. But it's extremely dangerous to others, not only to Jews. So I think that to answer your question, how do we fight it? We fight it by attacking anti-Semites, not by defending Jews, but by attacking anti-Semites. Because they are the enemies of their own people. And tell it clearly in so many words, and find the means to do that in what I would call the anti-social media and elsewhere. That's my answer to your first question.
You said, or you set an idea that the Holocaust should serve as a lesson and not become a precedent. How it should be translated in the ways of policies, how you can take that ideas into the level of policy.
Well, this is a question of how to fight genocide today. After 1945, any genocidal action, any mass atrocity crime, this is what it's called today, mass atrocity crime is based on World War II, on the Holocaust. You cannot deal with genocide today without dealing with the Holocaust as its beginning. Because today, the mass atrocity crimes that are carried on all over the place are based on ideas that came to fruition, if that's the right word to use, during the Holocaust. And so I think that that is something that people realize now. There are politicians who realize that. There are not very many, but they are. Generally speaking, politicians don't understand a thing. Most politicians don't understand a thing about the sources of the policies that they are called to defend or pursue. They understand the policies, the immediate ones, the sources, the background. I have no idea. It's talking. It's speeches. You find countries where they make the most wonderful, emphatic speeches about the Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. And they attack anti-Semitism. They have most wonderful speeches. They have absolutely no meaning whatsoever. And you've got to do whatever you can. And of course, our means are limited. To expose this, to tell the listeners, the world, your friends, the societies in which these speeches are made, including Israeli society, that what they are dealing with is something they don't understand. It's not an easy task, I can tell you. It's very, very difficult. But we have allies, which we did not have in the 1930s and 1940s. The Catholic Church was an enemy. It is no longer. I'm talking about the Vatican, not necessarily the churches in different countries. But today, the Vatican is an ally. The Jesuits are an ally. 100 years ago, I would have been sent I would have been sent 100 years ago, if I had said that the Jesuits are an ally, I would have been sent to a mental hospital. Today they are. I don't know, I don't want to go into the reasons for that. But we have allies, and not only amongst the Catholic Church. There are imams in the Muslim world, and radical Islam is a genocidal anti-Semitic movement. But there are imams, leaders, religious leaders in the Muslim world that attack anti-Semitism. We should utilize the fact that we have allies. We can't do anything else anyway, because we are altogether some 14 million people, Jews, amongst a 7.5 billion people in the world. And a tiny minority. We need allies, and we are capable of making them.
With your permission, I would like to ask about IHRA. About IHRA as a tool and its role. What do you see the future role of IHRA in the struggle against anti-Semitism? And also a question about the challenges that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is facing. What do you think about the attack on the IHRA definition that is used by us as a kind of litmus test to identify what is anti-Semitic and who is anti-Semite?
There are two parts to your question. Let me deal with the historical part, so to speak. In other words, you're asking me about the future of IHRA. Now, I'm a historian. I have tremendous difficulties in predicting the past. I'm totally hopeless when I'm asked to predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen in a few hours' time, in a few days' time, in a few weeks' time. Not the slightest idea. Usually when I predict something, I'm wrong. So I don't know. What if you ask me what we should do in expectation of the future? That's a different question. We should continue to do what we are doing at IHRA. We are trying our best. Yes, it is a difficult thing because IHRA, with its 34 countries, has internal splits and internal problems that are extremely difficult to overcome. But IHRA is on the liberal side of the world. There is an attack on liberalism all over the world. Most of the world is under the rule of autocratic or dictatorial regimes in different forms. And in the liberal world, between that and the anti-liberal world, there are countries that waver this way or that way. And IHRA is on the liberal side because it defends freedom of speech, which is what the IHRA definition says. And we have a task to perform there, a continuing task. Whether we will succeed, again, I don't know. The people who are involved in IHRA, by and large, after all, there are 250 to 300 experts who work within the IHRA community. Different working groups, also. We have a tremendous resource there. So we are trying to do our best. Now, the IHRA definition, the attack on the IHRA definition, the academic attack on the IHRA definition is fascinating. because it is contradictory, it is anti-academic, it is, to put it very bluntly, stupid. If you take the famous case of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, if you actually read what they say, I brought it along with me because when I read it, I don't believe what I'm reading. They are supposed to guarantee the possibility of criticizing the state of Israel and its policies. But this is what they say about anti-Semitism. Denying the right of the Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principles of equality. Anti-Semitism can be manifested in words, visual images, and deeds. Portraying Israel, that's anti-Semitism, portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence can be a coded way of racializing and stigmatizing Jews. Anti-Semitism is applying the symbols, images, and negative stereotypes of classical anti-Semitism to the state of Israel, holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct or treating Jews simply because they are Jews as agents of Israel, requiring people because they are Jewish publicly to condemn Israel and Zionism. Now, that actually justifies any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. It goes far beyond what the IHRA definition says, because the IHRA definition says that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. If you criticize Israel for what it does, that's not anti-Semitic. If it was, then an important minority of Israeli Jewish citizens would be anti-Semites. But if you criticize Israel for what it is, namely a state of the Jewish people, then yes, that's anti-Semitism. Isn't that clear? According to JDA, no. The JDA contradicts itself in the very text that it produces. And that's not the only case. That's the importance of the definition of IHRA. It is not contradictory, it's very brief, very concise, and very accurate. It's a tool, as has been pointed out by others here, correctly, I think. It's a tool to deal with anti-Semitism. It's not in itself a dealing with anti-Semitism. It's a tool to do so.
I would like to open for some people from the audience to ask questions. So if you have questions, that's the time. If not, I will continue. Yes, please.
Slowly and clearly, because my hearing is terrible.
Of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, but very, very slowly.
Okay, so I want to pick up, Professor Bauer, on your last point about the Jerusalem definition.
Yeah.
What you were just talking about, because in the previous panel and the discussion about the IHRA definition, I think that there's an obvious elephant in the room, which is the Jerusalem definition. And even though, I'll let him go ahead. Even though people have said that the Jerusalem definition, as you've accurately said, is stupid, contradicts itself, what do you think should be done, if anything, in response to the Jerusalem definition?
I got the gist of it, I think. what should be done is simply to carry on doing what we are doing. I don't think that a public attack on the JDA has any point, simply because there's nothing to attack there. It's simply, and the problem is that intelligent and very important academics have signed this. And when I read the names of the people who signed this, they are people who have learned, who taught, who teach how to read a text. They obviously forgot what they are teaching. They don't read the text.
They tell us that our time is over. So I would like to thank you, Professor Bauer. I'm sure that people will interact with you. I think that I want to thank you for all the things that you did during your entire career and that you will continue to do in order to take the main message that the Holocaust will be a lesson and not a precedent, and that we will be able to overcome this phenomena of anti-Semitism and to limit it as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam Katz and Professor Yehuda Bauer for joining us today. It is truly an honor to have someone as esteemed and incredible as Professor Bauer with us, and we're really happy to have you here. We will now continue with a similar format that we had yesterday, TED Talks with two esteemed speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Malcolm Hoenlein, the Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents. Please, the stage is yours.
Now I know what the Chazan feels like at the end of Ne'ilah. I think the old adage that everything has been said, but yet there's still more people to say it. I will use my limited time to try to suggest a different approach than the one we have adopted till now. This is a wonderful assembly, and we thank the MFA for doing it. All the knowledgeable, talented people who have been brought together, experts, professionals, organizations that are deeply devoted and focused on the holy work of fighting anti-Semitism. We see the proliferation of efforts, of projects. We see all of those who have become involved, including states, and we see the courageous initiatives that many have undertaken. When Jews face challenges, we look back. And this is especially important in a time of the cancel history and the cancel culture that tries to erase history, tries to revise history in order to redirect the future. Jews look back and put an emphasis on history, not because we want to get lost in the past like the fundamentalists, but because we want to learn the lessons of the past, that we find inspiration and direction from what has occurred in the past. And when it comes to the issue of anti-Semitism, Zechirah, remembrance, which is so central in the great commandments given to us, Zecharet Yom HaShabbat, Zecharet Yetzias Mitzrayim, that we're told to remember, because remembrance keeps it alive with us. It keeps the message. That's why the word chosen for the Holocaust was not Nakama, revenge, but Zechar, remember, because it keeps the lessons of the 6 million with us. It reminds us what never again must be, that it's a pledge to the future. So we look back in order to look forward. Orwell said it, Winston Churchill said, whoever controls the past controls the future. Our Chazal said it 1,000 years earlier. But if we look to our Avos and Imams, we look to our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah were told, you cannot live amongst us as a Jew. Isaac was told, you cannot live amongst us, and Jacob was told, you cannot live. The three prototypes of anti-Semitism, expulsion, annihilation, discrimination, started then. But the ultimate example was Pharaoh. What did Pharaoh say about the Jews? Chava nischak malo. He doesn't accuse them of doing anything wrong, just like the anti-Semites of today and their complaints against Jews and the collective Jew, the state of Israel. Chava nischak malo. We have to deal shrewdly with them because maybe they will join our enemies. Maybe they will do something. Vayoreu asana mitzrim. The Egyptians wronged us instead of saying they did wrong to us because they had to wrong the Jews. They had to show that the Jews were responsible for all the ills that befell Egyptian society. Hitler did the same thing. He didn't just announce a final solution. He first wronged the Jews. He showed that the Jews were responsible for all the ills that befell German society after the Versailles Treaty, World War I, and everything else, the economic ills, the social ills. Everything was blamed on the Jews. That is why b'chol dar v'dar, when we say it in the Haggadah, it doesn't use the past tense. It says omdim aleinu. It's the present tense. Because the enemies arise in every generation, and only by understanding how past generations dealt with it can we understand how we deal with its current incarnation. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asked, you mean there wasn't one generation that didn't have it? Every single generation. And he said, read the next paragraph, where we read, Seulamad, Lavan bikesh lakar sakol. That Lavan was hosting Yaakov. He didn't like his son-in-law very much, but Yaakov grew rich, his family grew, and he thought things were all right. And all the time, Lavan was plotting against him. So he said, those generations that become comfortable, that think it's not us, quickly learn. That is true of our generation. How many times do we come together to scream and yell about the threat of anti-Semitism, but most people didn't want to hear it, didn't believe it, were skeptical, even accusatory, that organizations did it for their own purposes. But the only answer in Egypt was when the Jews said, no more. When God took us out, mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim, from the oppression, and the commentators say, no, it means savlanut, the patience, that as long as Jews said, we can take it, more bricks, less straw, more persecution, more slavery. God said, you're not ready to be redeemed. But once they said no more, he said, now you're ready. Our generation has to say now, no more. The first kina that we read on Tisha B'Av, after Eicha, for those who go to synagogue, we read the keynote right after the reading of Eicha. The first one deals with the Jews of worms. You know why? Because when the Jews came back to Yerushalayim, they said, you have your great Yerushalayim there. We have our small Jerusalem here, and refused to come back and join them in the building of a Jewish state. Those who turn their backs on Jewish history pay the price for it. And that has been true throughout all of the generations. So now we face that challenge today, I believe. We are dealing with a pandemic of hate, of Jew hate, and not anti-Semitism because it's an antiseptic term, though we all use it. There is no vaccine, and there is no way to isolate it, though we can't quarantine those who engage and spread this virulent virus. You cannot cure anti-Semitism any more than we can eliminate virus from our world. It's time for true climate control, addressing global hate. This is a time for all of us to come together to face a true war against the Jewish people, the Jewish faith, the Jewish state, the Jewish past, and the Jewish future. No one is exempt. It's the lesson of history that all of those who thought, it's not me, it's only those Jews, everyone will feel its consequences. It cannot be contained, but it can be brought back under the rocks. We attack it from all sides: legislation, legal activities, education, public exposure, private entreaties. We do it through online and offline efforts, essays and analysis, protests and promises, pledges of all kinds. But it's time for us to do something different. to create a global movement, not another organization, to learn the lessons from what we did with Soviet Jewry, when we put aside individual prerogatives and egos, but maintain each one their identity, each one's initiatives, to be part of a coherent whole. We need a collective voice, not a Jewish voice, declaring it ends now. Jew hatred ends now, and its progenitors and others will be held to account. It's time to force them out of the sunlight and under the rocks. We need to enlist and encourage people of every faith, because Jews are the victims, we're not the perpetrators. The onus must fall on the non-Jewish world, especially influentials in politics and education, academia, culture, in media, and entertainment. Those who influence, those who shape public opinion, those who can make a difference, who can reach audiences that we couldn't. It's time for them to be enlisted and for them to stand up and speak out. We must make it unacceptable to express anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. Let's harness all the energy, the goodwill, the intelligence that is here to launch a comprehensive campaign, a movement that will truly change the face of the fight against anti-Semitism. The challenge is clear, the situation overwhelming. The danger is immediate and real. The time is now. Each of us must consider, what is our responsibility? How many of us thought what we would have done if we were alive in the 30s? Now's the time when you find the answer. We need a global structure with branches focusing on security, on the internet, on legislature, each of us contributing all of the expertise and knowledge and brilliance that we've seen expressed here. I believe we will find great support. Key leaders who for years wouldn't talk to me about anti-Semitism all of a sudden are calling me. The top officials in media and entertainment in Hollywood have been calling us to join in this effort. Ask any survivor what they see, what they smell, what they hear, and they will tell you that they have heard this music before. We can and we must come together. I have much more to say on this, but obviously I'm getting her nervous already. But I do want to conclude with a few points. I'm sick and tired of memorials to dead Jews. The world is very good at mourning us. It's time that they learn to stand up for living Jews and a vibrant, living Jewish state. No more memorials. I want them to show that courage and that determination by standing up for us now. And we must proudly proclaim that we are Zionists. We cannot let them turn it into a pejorative. We have to declare ourselves and declare ourselves with Israel. And whatever differences, stop making excuses for it. If you have a difference, you can say it. We need an international day of solidarity, of ending Jew hatred, where we call on everyone to come out, to speak out, maybe to wear a blue star, to put signs in their windows, days of prayer, days of solidarity of all kinds. It means us. They mean all of us. No one will be exempted from this. We are indeed one, and the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. If we come together, we will be a force that will be unstoppable. Unity does not demand homogeneity. We have to stop the infighting and show that unity, which was the one precondition God set for every great miracle that has happened to us throughout history. He asks us to stand together, to feel what's in each other's hearts, to understand that the danger to one is a danger to all. And I believe that the haters mean us, all of us, and they mean to implement what they say. Do we?
Thank you very much for that very powerful speech. It is an honor to call to the stage Mr. Dan Mariashan, the CEO of B'nai B'rith International.
It's one thing to follow Yehuda Bauer, but to follow Yehuda Bauer and Malcolm Hohenlein is a major task. When I came up to check this podium this morning, early, because we got here early, there was a note already that says 2 minutes. So I've been put on notice. Before I begin, and I want to talk today briefly about context, because we've talked a lot about the present, we've talked a lot about all of the issues and the threats that we're confronting. So I'd like to talk a little about context, but before I do, it was mentioned yesterday, and I think it bears mentioning again today, that on the 18th, on Sunday, is the anniversary of two signal historic attacks on the Jewish people. The AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires in 1994, and the bombing in Burgas against Israeli tourists who were visiting in Bulgaria. And we shouldn't forget also, 2 years before AMIA, there was the bombing of the Israeli embassy, which killed 29 people. These are important anniversaries. These were attacks against the Jewish people, and we should pause to remember, particularly in the context of what we've been discussing the last couple of days. Well, for 2,000 years, Jews lived largely at the sufferance of potentates and kings, autocrats and despots, and on occasion, living as a protected minority. In a word, we were powerless, subject to persecution, to pogroms, discriminatory laws like numerus clausus, and other abridgments of our civil and human rights. My mother, who immigrated as a child with her parents from Lithuania in the very early part of the 20th century, witnessed in her lifetime the full panoply of anti-Semitism of her times, which she often related to me. There was the lynching in 1913 of Leo Frank, the manager of the pencil factory in Atlanta, who was wrongly accused of murdering one of his employees. There was Henry Ford, the great Henry Ford, the publisher of the Dearborn Independent, which was an anti-Semitic publication. There was the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization that in the 1930s marched in the streets of New York City and other cities around the country in support of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And there was Father Charles Coughlin, the Detroit priest and rabid anti-Semite whose weekly radio broadcast drew millions and millions of listeners in the 1930s. And there was more. Discrimination in hiring of Jews, in housing, in college and university admissions. I remember watching my two older sisters apply for college in the late 1950s and hearing the table talk in our house about certain quotas that were imposed by prominent universities in the United States. And there was discrimination in accommodations. And I found in the archive of B'nai B'rith, I just want to read to you very briefly, exactly what it was that Jews were facing in that very difficult period of the early part, the first half of the 20th century. Here's a letter from the manager of the Winona Park Hotel, which was in Minnesota, and it's to a Mr. Nathan Scharf, dated March 25th, 1947. It says, "Dear Mr. Scharf, just returned from business trip and found your letter awaiting me. First, due to restrictions around our lakes, we must know whether you are Jewish or not, as Jewish people are not allowed." And there was another from the Woodland Lodge, another place in Wisconsin. It said to Mr. Eulander, Mrs. Eulander, "We are returning your check in the amount of $5, which is apparently a deposit. After seeing your letter, we note that you were associated in some manner with Camp Maccabee. Perhaps we should advise you that we prefer not to cater to people of the Jewish race." And that's dated July 10th, 1947. And finally, a letter from a very prestigious girls' school in Charleston, South Carolina. This is from the headmistress. She writes, "I'm sorry I have to return the application for your daughter to enter in 1961. This was dated July 29th, 1959. We appreciate your interest in the school, but we have found that it is a wise policy not to accept students of religious faiths different from the majority of the girls here. While we are a non-sectarian school, our resident girls are all members of Christian churches. Past experience has taught us that Jewish girls find it difficult to fit into our schedules because of the different times of church services." Now, the Zionism-Racism Resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1975 states that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And while it was ultimately rescinded 16 years later in 1991, it became the progenitor of much contemporary anti-Semitism that we are experiencing today. And it has enjoyed a long shelf life. Many countries broke relations with Israel in the wake of the Zionism-Racism Resolution. But more than that, there would have probably been no hate fest at the Durban Conference on Racism in 2001 had there not been a Zionism equals racism resolution. Because in Durban, it was there that the rhetoric used today by the anti-Semites, all of those whom we've been discussing here the last couple of days, apartheid state, among other canards, that rhetoric came to the fore with Durban. And you could also say that the BDS movement also found its origins at that time. Now that resolution, the Zionism Racism Resolution, was bad enough. But the difference between 1975 and 2001, when Durban happened, is the appearance and the rapid growth of the internet and the dawn of the age of social media, the great multiplier force of hatred. Who thought 20 years ago that we would see violence in the streets against Jews, the kind we had seen in the Arab world in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, or later at Toulouse, Antwerp, Brussels, and Rome? But it now has arrived on American shores, in Charlottesville, the bombings in Pittsburgh and Poway, and earlier, and people have forgotten about the shootings at Jewish community institutions in Los Angeles, Seattle, and Kansas City, 1991 and 1999, and all the way into the 21st century. Who would have ever dreamed that Jews would be beaten in Midtown Manhattan or in Los Angeles with mobs intimidating diners in those places to answer the demand, "Are you Jewish?" Or that we would see overt anti-Semitism and outright bigotry from members of Congress from the progressive left to the far right. We had members of Congress, some of you will remember these names before, who were anti-Semites and who worked assiduously against Israel. There was Paul Findley of Illinois and Pete McCloskey of California. Later on, James Traficant of Ohio. Traficant was one who defended John Demjanjuk, for example. Well, at the time, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook for these anti-Semites to use to advance their anti-Semitic views. And today, we do have it. And today, those members of Congress who engage in this kind of rhetoric use it freely, and they have millions of followers. Today, those who say it's all about the Benjamins, who charge us with dual loyalty, or who state shamelessly, as they did just a couple of weeks ago during the fighting in Gaza, that Israel is an apartheid state or that Israel engages in state terror. They do so in the full view of their nation and the world, and quite honestly, I see insufficient pushback from those who should know better. I'm finishing. Or that we would see a leading mayoral candidate in New York City with the largest Jewish population of any city in the world, New York City, a city to which Jews have contributed so much to the building of that great city in so many different ways, would have to retract a pro-Israel tweet that he tweeted out during the campaign, or that a chancellor of a university with a very large Jewish enrollment would have to retract a statement decrying anti-Semitism. So what are the prescriptives? And if I may, I have 5 points. As every speaker has said, from Deborah Lipstadt on through these past couple of days, and Malcolm just said it too, about there not being a cure. It's not exactly a cure that we're able to effectuate, but there are some things that we can do, and I would suggest the following. The first thing is we need to educate our own community about who it is that we are. Young people who arrive on campus at the age of 18 have parents who are in their 40s who have no recollection of the Six-Day War or the 73 War when Israel faced such existential threats. They don't know about their history. They don't know about the great contributions that the Jewish people have made to the United States or to so many other countries in so many different fields. Second, we need friends and allies. Very good to hear about the countries that are now deciding not to show up at the Durban 4 conference. Extremely important, and we hope that list will grow. And we have to thank those countries. Do that. Thank those countries for saying that they will not go. But we need friends and allies, and I learned that lesson very early in my life in the 5th grade. I was the only Jewish child in that class. I was one of 4 Jewish children in a school of about 300 children, and I had a teacher, Mrs. Kellum, who had already taught at that point probably 50 years. And one day she called me out of class, and the one thing you don't want to do if you're the only Jew in a class when you're that old is to be different. And she called me out, and I can see it still in my mind outside the door, and she said, Danny, I want you to know that the janitor found a swastika on the doorpost of the boys' bathroom, she said. And it has been washed off, and we will make sure that anyone who puts it up will be punished. And that was a great lesson. And the lesson was not only that the school did something about it, but that we need friends and allies, and we can go through that entire list, be they mayors, educators, church leaders, people from the local media, governors, prime ministers, whomever, people that we saw today earlier, like Eric Pickles and so many others, and Katrina von Schnurbein. Those are the people that we need to help us. There are only 16 million of us in the world. We cannot do this alone. Third, person to person, working one person at a time, the old-fashioned way. We talk about social media, but the truth is everybody has friends, neighbors, colleagues, and other family members who are ignorant of the issues. And we need to play our part to have to be educated ourselves. We have to be informed. We can do our part to set the record straight in this time of great challenge to our people. Fourth and fifth, encourage the endorsement of the IHRA definition, which you've heard, and I don't need to go into that, extremely important. So these 2 days have been a great way to recharge our batteries, many of us taking the first trip to Israel in 16 months, to check in on best practices, which we've done, to share information, and even to commiserate, and to rededicate ourselves to fighting and winning a battle that will require all of us the kind of cohesiveness which seems to be elusive today. A cohesiveness in our community, a unity in our community, as Malcolm said, that we need so much in order to prevail and succeed. Thank you very much.